Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the program Through My Eyes with Professor Bolaji Akinyemi this evening. Prof, good evening, sir.
Good evening to you and to our usual guests on this program.
Yes, thank you to our viewers for being here again. Don't forget, if you haven't clicked on that subscribe button, do so. And please feel free to share the link with your friends or people who you know would benefit from this program. Sir, last week, the world was hit with the news of this AUKUS deal. Very unexpected, and you spoke about this last week. But I have a question for you this evening. As we begin to see the reactions from different countries on this deal, and sir, unless I'm mistaken, other than the parties involved in the deal, I haven't heard of any other country referring to this deal as a good one. And more importantly, we now have President Biden having spoken to President Macron, and he seems to be accepting that maybe there were some missteps in how the deal was carried out. Sir, do you want to help us understand where we should stand on the deal and on President Biden's credibility as a foreign policy player?
Well, um, I think you've indicated where you think I should go. Um, Obviously, when you are dealing with President Biden, um, it pays to be a nuisance. Let me put it that way. I say that because France has been a nuisance on this issue. She's just behaved like a spoilt brat. Um, there's no doubt that she's lost something financially because, I mean, this negotiation between Australia and France has been going on for some years. But what France is complaining about is what France has done to several African countries. Several African countries. She's stabbed them in the back, overthrown their president, uh, all because French interests, which were negotiated, were not even negotiated, which were forced down the throat of African leaders at independence. Um, um, African leaders, when they then complain, I mean, France wields the big stick. But the reason I said that, France, not necessarily Macron alone, but France has behaved like a spoilt brat, is because my mind goes back to a few episodes of French petulance, starting, at least the one that I'm aware of, from the time of the Second World War. Both Winston Churchill and General Eisenhower, who was the supreme commander of Allied forces in Europe during the Second World War, complained bitterly about the arrogance of General de Gaulle. I mean, de Gaulle behaved as if he wasn't a refugee in England, but as if, England and the whole world owed him and France all that they were asking. He ran to Britain and took refuge in Britain, and yet he behaved as if the whole world ran into France and took refuge in France. When, in spite of the fact that the forces available to de Gaulle was probably the smallest of the Allied forces, when the Allied forces landed in Normandy, when the Allied now re-invaded Europe, they landed in Normandy, which was the on the French coastline. De Gaulle made two requests or demands, not requests. If you know De Gaulle, the way he will make his demarche, he made two demands. One, that when Allied troops are about to enter Paris, having pushed back the German forces, General Eisenhower should allow the troops to be French troops, forgetting that it is not French troops who have been fighting all that war from the coastline. It's been American and British troops. He insisted that for the pride of the French, he wanted French troops to be the ones who would be marching in front. Number two, he insisted that he didn't want to see black troops amongst those who will march into Paris, forgetting that these black troops, mostly American, have been losing their lives, dying to liberate France. He said it wasn't good for French morale to see them. So that's France for you. And I think I've said it once on this program that since Napoleon, every French president has thought he was ruler of the world, to be appeased, to be petted, to be crowned. Nonsense. France is not a superpower. France does not even merit its position on the Security Council of the United Nations when Germany and Japan, etc., are not members of the Security Council. At the end of the Second World War, it was again to appease de Gaulle that France was given a seat on the Security Council, forgetting that German forces had overrun France and scattered their forces and so on. So Macron is still behaving true to type. And I don't know why American leaders kowtow to French leaders. You are quite right that Biden apologized to France, while Britain was holding fast that no, there's nothing to apologize about. This is international politics. And people warned Australia that be careful in hooking on your anchor to the United States. Because now Francis is sending back its ambassador to the United States. It so far is not returning its ambassador to Australia. So in other words, he say, Australia, we can punish you, and we are going to punish you, But the United States is too big for us to punish. But we will accept. We will accept an apology from the United States. France has been insulting to Great Britain, treating it with contempt. I mean, I think if it comes to, fortunately, it won't do that, but if it comes to a war between Great Britain and France, I'm not sure that France can fight Great Britain. And France should not forget that 2 world wars, British troops went to liberate France from German forces. But France has always wanted to be regarded as a superpower. France is simply a medium power in Europe, a medium European power. So, but Biden had apologized, which then goes to the core of your question. What does this say? I mean, within a month, you've bungled your exit from Afghanistan, and now you've admitted you've bungled your negotiation with Australia vis-a-vis France. What does it even say to the British? That you can depend on this guy when it comes to hard-nosed diplomacy. I mean, I was surprised. I must admit to you that it will get to the point where he will be kowtowing to France. I thought it was uncalled for, but then there you are. I've had my own uneasiness about Biden and his strategic team's capability from day one, and I said so. I said I'm looking for experienced hands. I'm just looking for experienced hands, people who have been maybe deputy secretary of state before under a democratic president, people who have been maybe deputy secretary of defense or something. Those are the guys who should be holding the secretary level. But instead, the people who he has brought in, they have no credibility as defense and strategic players on the world scene.
Hmm. There's a question here that says, isn't the AUKUS treaty already a fait accompli? Would it have been right to allow Australia to be quietly swallowed by China?
Well, I think the treaty in itself is commendable as a strategic move to checkmate China. I'm not quarreling at all with that treaty. I mean, if I were Australian Prime Minister, I would rather have the United States as an ally than France in terms of the capability, military capability. I mean, the United States can still face down China any day rather than France. So I think the Australia made the right choice, and I think that the United States, in responding, there's a lot, by the way, that we don't know about this treaty. Who made the first move? Was it Australia that approached the United States, or was it the United States that approached Australia. My suspicion is that it was the United States that approached Australia because the United States is simply not going to cut and run in its face off with China. And even if she was planning to do so before, I think Boris Johnson must have whispered a few words to strengthen the backbone of Biden that, well, yes, China may be an upcoming superpower, but it hasn't reached your level yet. So there are still, more years of leadership from the United States in that area. If you show, uh, if you show shakiness and you give China the impression that can just overrun you, overrun New Zealand, overrun Australia, overrun Taiwan, overrun Japan, and so on, the Chinese will do so. The Chinese don't like weakness. You've got to stand up to them. I suspect that Boris Johnson must have whispered such words into the ears of Biden. I think the treaty was a right treaty. I think so.
Hmm. Before we move on, sir, there is a comment here. I think this person is trying to assert the position of France as maybe a world power to be reckoned with, because he refers to the fact that France was one of the original five that attended the meeting to give back to the United Nations, and the fact that France was already in consultation with Australia on building the submarine. So, France did that on their own. They negotiated with Australia on their own. And maybe we should still be giving the French government some credibility for having achieved that feat in the first place.
Well, two issues. You've raised two issues. That France was one of the original five and gave birth to the UN. But the fact is, should France have been present in the labor room? And my position is that at the end of the Second World War, France itself was, flat out. She shouldn't have been present in the labor room, but probably in order to punish China and to also appease de Gaulle, who was a most difficult figure. They allowed France to be present at the birth of the UN. It doesn't mean that France was entitled by merit to be present there. The second issue is this about the treaty with Australia. There, I will agree that it could have been better handled. The issue of disengagement of Australia from that, from its agreement with France, maybe could have been better handled. Fortunately for Australia, I don't think they got to the point of signing an agreement, or else Australia would have been made to pay through its nose and whatever else for damages. So I don't think they got to the point of signing an agreement before Australia started to back off. But I agree with the gentleman or lady who sent in the comment that the disengagement is better handled by simply saying, I'm sorry, we are no longer able to pursue this. We have a better offer. Countries do that all the time. we have a better offer. It's not pleasant if you've ever had to deal, to negotiate with any of these countries. My goodness. Um, they'll bombard you with calls. Delegations will be sent to you. A state visit will be proposed. So I can understand Australia saying, rather than go through all this pressure and so on, let me, con, complete the negotiation with the United States first. We are not told up to now what the offers are. Who is paying? Is America really going to pay some money? I don't mean bribe, but is the United States contribution to this? Is it going to be some financial assistance to Australia? Financial assistance that Australia would not have got from France? We don't know. We need to know more about what went on between it's four countries now: Australia, France, Britain, and the United States.
So, sir, I want to ask two questions before we leave this point on AUKUS. The first one being, do you see this particular treaty expanding significantly beyond the number of countries involved right now? There has been some suggestion that that could very well be the case. And the second point that I want to get your view on is that at the same time where France is complaining about losing this deal with Australia, the armed forces minister, the French armed forces minister, was in Mali trying to stop the government in Mali from working with Russian mercenaries. What is your take on that position, sir?
Yes, this is all linked up with French role in the Sahel, its relationship with its former colonies. The kind of agreement falls down the throat of its former colonies. France had insisted that it was pulling out of Mali militarily. Um, with that, Mali was confronted with a situation where, Mali knows that alone, it probably, not that probably, it cannot fight this guerrilla warfare with ISIS in the desert. Most of the equipment for its armed forces are from France. So the French already have a stranglehold on the Malian military forces. If Mali was then going to look for forces that will supplant or that will fill the vacuum by the departing French forces, it had to look elsewhere. Now, the one thing that France will not tolerate is having any other force present in its former territories, because it weakens its stranglehold on them. So, on one hand, France, asserts its sovereignty in all over the world, insists that the sovereignty must be respected, that it must not be stabbed in the back, that, and yet you don't respect the sovereignty of independent French-speaking African countries. You don't respect it. We've talked about the colonial tax before on this program, which till today is still in force, where each African country pays annually an amount of money to France because, according to France contribution to these territories during the colonial period. I mean, France took out minerals. These countries paid for the salaries and what have you of French personnel in their territories. And yet, when France was going, you imposed upon them what you call the colonial tax, as if French money was spent on these territories, as if French money was spent building the roads, building hospitals. You insist on their paying, and they are still paying till today. So what France finds unacceptable in Europe in terms of its being treated in the rest of the world, it insists on imposing that on its own territories. To me, I find the disequilibrium unacceptable.
Sir, that was the second part to my question, sir. Do you see this treaty expanding significantly beyond US, UK, Australia?
Yes, yes. If to placate France, I could see the US insisting on that. And it could then amount to, well, in building these nuclear powered submarines, there are several parts. And part of that contract could then be given to France to appease France. And I'm afraid the power disparity between the United States and Australia and between United States and Great Britain is such that those two countries really cannot put their feet down and refuse. So yes, I can see it. I can see
Okay.
it.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's move on to the United Nations. Someone has already mentioned United Nations on the chart, but there is the summit going on now, and we've seen President Biden give his first speech to the United Nations. Number one, did that speech resonate with you? And did it assert America as the world leader that we expect America to be? And secondly, the Taliban also requested to have representation at the United Nations summit. What is your view on that, sir?
Um, if I closed my eyes and perhaps ignore the ignore the voice, so to speak, I will say I've had that speech before. Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Bill Clinton, Jimmy Carter, um, Obama. these are, speeches which resonated, lifted your spirit, represent America, what America wants the world to believe that it represents in the world. And to some extent, yes. But at the same time, it was under these leaders that you've had um, sanctions imposed upon Cuba, in spite of the fact that there are United Nations resolutions in the past 3 or 4 years condemning those sanctions and asking for the blockade of Cuba to be lifted, but they haven't been lifted. It was under Kennedy that Lumumba was killed. Yes, it was under Nixon that you had the government of Allende overthrown in Chile. This was a United States instigated coup in Chile. And since then, we've had a few a few American instigated coups in Latin America. Right now, there are sanctions against Venezuela. So I've had this kind of speech given. What I want to see is America walk the talk. Let us see the United States being actually a moral voice and a moral actor in the world. It's very strange, the juxtaposition of Biden's speech and the pictures we've seen on, well, let me not mention names of the mega media here. Visits to the prisons in Afghanistan, not run by the Taliban, but run by the American forces when they were in Afghanistan. With, in fact, the American commentator saying this reminds him of, again, the prison in Iraq. And what struck me was when the Taliban commander who was taking the media around these prisons, when he was asked whether he felt, and he himself was a prisoner there for, I think, 4 or 5 years. And they asked him, do you feel any bitterness towards the Americans? And he said, no, that war is all over. We are ready to have relationship with every country in the world, including the United States. And it struck me that if the shoes were reversed, if it was an American commander who was asked that question, I could predict what the answer would have been. We will chase down every Taliban, commander in this prison who did this to American forces. We will hunt them down and we will make them face blah, 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 blah. Difference in culture. Difference in culture. So I mean, I don't know whether this media did this deliberately. That why you have this highly enervating and inspiring speech going on by Biden, they are showing what actually America represents in conflict areas. I'm afraid, I'm wiser now than I was when Kennedy was in power in 1960, 61, 62, when I really thought what I was hearing was the reality of policy, not knowing that, countries operate on two levels. One is what they say, the other is what they do. So, and that goes, if, I mean, let me quickly create any impression being created. That goes for all countries, all leaders, because they know the world is listening to them. So they say the correct things. And then, if you now analyze their policies, whether this is Russia, whether this is China or Korea or Japan, you then see something that is different.
What is your
As
take on the
regards,
second point, sir?
that's where I was going. That's where I
Thank
was going. Um, as regards the Taliban's application to be heard at this present UN General Assembly summit. It's not going to happen this year, but it will happen next year unless the Taliban gets overthrown. There is a credentials committee which meets, and applications from government are sent to this credentials committee. Normally, it is routine. It's routine, unless there are problems. And that credentials committee is not going to meet until November, at the tail end of this UN General Assembly summit. I suspect that at that time, they will accept the credentials, I say, unless the Taliban has been overthrown by then, but it will be applicable to the next session, not this present session.
All right, sir. Let's move to Africa, and quite a lot happening, sir. But I want to start with one point, which we seem to be bringing up somewhat too frequently on this program, and this is the issue of military coups, which seem, for some reason, we're hearing more and more of this kind of activity going on. But this time around, it's the failed coup in Sudan. And so you've mentioned the issue around good governance, leadership, making sure that our leaders do the right thing to avoid this kind of thing. It seems not to be falling on the ears of military leaders. How do you respond to what's happened in Sudan now?
Ah, you almost frightened me when you talked about a coup. I thought that while I was having a nap, there had been a coup behind me. And I was wondering, where now? I didn't know you were going to make reference to the attempted coup in the Sudan. Um, you see, is there any coup that the world intervention has managed to reverse? Obviously, suspension of uh, countries where there have been coups, whether from ECOWAS or the African Union or from the United Nations, has not frightened the boys in khaki, and it has not made them change their minds. Um, especially, especially because um, people in that country themselves have started seeing soldiers as, again, reformers on horseback, coming to rescue them from basically another coup. Because when leaders, in gross violation of the values of their constitution, engineer amendments to that constitution to allow them term elongation, occupy the office beyond the terms allowed originally by the constitution, people really feel that this is a coup against the constitution. And given the fact that the, the, the people, frankly, faced with a military that is obeying the dictates of the man in power, they feel hopeless. When that same military now turns around against that man, they welcome that military, and they are not impressed by the attempted intervention by regional or international organizations, whom they feel were silent when their constitution was being violated. Now, in the case of the Sudan, you recall that this government in Sudan came into being when the previous government was overthrown by a combination of people's demonstrations, people's power, and um, the military teaming up with the people to overthrow him. The government in power had been an alliance between, if you like, the reformist military and the reformist civilians. But it's like people feel they are overstaying their term. They have not addressed the issues of economic reform. They haven't really sorted out amongst themselves the question of transition back to a fully democratic government. And when you have things dragging on that long, it allows differences within that government to probably spill over into the military and the civilians who may not be happy with what is going on. As long as a military thinks it can get away, that it can overthrow a government and not have resistance from the civilians, it will attempt it. And what we now have in the case of the Sudan is that they feel that there is evidence of the civilian disenchantment with the government that is in power. And again, to round it up, with direct reference to your question, they have seen in Mali, they have seen in Chad, whereas, you know, military intervention in Guinea, military intervention, successful, and in spite of intervention by ECOWAS or African Union or the United Nations, it's been successful. And nobody dare calls a successful coup treason. If it's not successful, you could call it treason because the people who attempt it are going to get themselves executed. But once it is successful, none dares call it treason.
Now let's move to Tunisia because we are seeing in Tunisia some of these points that you've raised as trigger points for this kind of intervention by other forces. In Tunisia, the president has not only suspended parts of the constitution. He's saying he's going to rule by decree. What's your take on Tunisia, and where do you see this going?
Well, from the day the president acted extra constitutionally in suspending parliament, in dissolving the government, even though he said at that time he was doing it for a week or two, I said to myself, this is a coup against the Constitution. You see, you cannot be half pregnant. It's either you are pregnant or you are not. You cannot suspend parts of the Constitution and claim that you haven't carried out a coup. But obviously, what the president of Tunisia has decided to do is, instead of proclaiming that that he has actually carried out a coup, is decided to do it piecemeal by piecemeal. But to me, it was clear from day one that this was a coup and that he's slowly testing the ground to see whether he will get away with it. And given the fact that there is evidence that the regional powers, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, had decided to give him a chance because they themselves were fed up with what I will call democracy without development. Tunisia was going nowhere. The economy was grinding to a halt. Parliamentarians seems to enjoy the sound of their own voice rather than approving and debating and approving programs designed to solve the problems of Tunisia. They decided to give the president a chance to get on with the process of development, not democracy. In any case, this is something that has been done in Egypt, and it seems to be working. And Saudi Arabia, believes in, in what I call instrumental democracy. They decided to give him a chance rather than start having another Arab Spring. The first one started in Tunisia. And so they decided maybe they won't risk a second one again starting in Tunisia. So my reading is that there is a coup that had happened in Tunisia, and it's now going to depend on how the president can, how much support he has from the military, and to what extent his intervention is going to start yielding results.
Thank you for that, sir. Let's deal with one question from Europe, and that is the departure of Angela Merkel, the German Chancellor. Some have described her as being more about policy than politics. What is your take on her impact on German and world politics?
She's been a very successful chancellor, a very successful German leader, and a very successful world leader. She's handled about 4 or 5 British prime ministers. She has handled, I suppose, 3 or 4 French presidents, and she's successfully outlasted 4 or 5 American presidents. She has presided over a period um, of German economic success. Uh, she was a reassuring figure on the German scene and on the European scene. Very tolerant of several petulant interventions by the French. On the French still under their bonnet, be under their bonnet about the strength of Germany. And in spite of the fact that the Germans have not bothered their heads openly about French military status, it's obvious, it's evident to everyone that the German economic status is the powerhouse in Europe, but without frightening or threatening anybody. You know, she reminded me of the Israeli female prime minister. Um, um, I'm sorry, I can't remember her name now. Anyway, Israel has had only one female prime minister. But, you know, calm, but knowing where she's going. And the Germans owe her a lot for the way she's presided over their success. Even at the time when the European currency was shaky, she stood firm because she knew if that experiment of having one European currency, if it failed, the whole idea of European unity was at stake. So she stood firm and supported it, even though the German Deutschmark was not under under any threat, but she threw her weight behind the European currency. So it's I think the Germans will miss her her calming, grandmotherly nature. Uh, Europe will miss her because you see, she believed more in reaching agreements than being frontally corrosive in her disagreements with other leaders. So it's we're all going to miss her, um, and but she's been a successful world leader.
What do you think Europe will be like without her, particularly
That
the
that
EU?
Well, that depends on who succeeds her as chancellor. Let us face it. I think Europe has still not gotten over the Nazi period. They still look with apprehension at developments in Germany. I think the Germans need a new chancellor who has the same calming characteristics as Angela Merkel. The same, the same chancellor who, at the back of his mind, will be an understanding of why Europe is still apprehensive about Germany and tries not to be too forceful in asserting German leadership. You know, one African leader, Houphouët-Boigny, who was president of Ivory Coast or Cote d'Ivoire, said to me when I visited him as foreign minister, he said, Nigeria should not lose its head in competition with France or lose its head in worrying about French policies in Africa. He said, we all know that the future in Africa belongs under Nigerian leadership because the cost of French presence in Africa is going to get to a point when it will be too much for the French. So they said, so Nigeria really should just calm it and let France play her games and then at the right time assert its own. And that reminds me that this is precisely also what for almost 50 years the Chinese had done. I remember being told by a Chinese leader that I once met that they are not in any hurry to proclaim Chinese leadership in the world. He said, we've been there before. We've been a world leader before, and we're going to be a world leader in the future. There is no reason to, you know, to proclaim it. So it's the same thing. Again, the time is still not ripe for the Germans to proclaim in reaction because the French will challenge them. We spent the first 30 minutes of this program talking about French petulance. You are going to get it. Already you've seen some manifestation of it when, Krona said actually France should replace or should be an additional international language. You are going to start getting from Macron, especially since he's facing an election coming, to irritate the new German leader. The new German leader should just cool it calmly. It will outlast the French.
Thank you very much for your time this evening, sir. We have run out of time now. I was going to ask you about Algeria, Morocco, but we'll leave that till next week. The tensions are rising there, and we'll like to know your views. Where
Okay.
is that confrontation going to end up? Thank you to our viewers. Thank you, sir, for this evening. Thank you,
Thank
sir.
you. Wakanda.